One of the most remarkable stories Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran, something that has become really symbolic of the help of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that when Allah comes to someone's aid and rescue, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes the impossible possible. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this entire worldly system, the entire order of the universe that we live in, this is the creation of Allah. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can override it and overrule it at an instance. And that story is the story of Ibrahim alayhi salam, specifically revolving and involving the fire. What ended up happening is that Ibrahim alayhi salam was following and obeying the commandment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded Ibrahim alayhi salam to teach the people about the oneness of God and to explain to them, to convince them, to try to get them to understand that them worshiping all these idols that they worshipped was wrong, it was incorrect, and it was foolish. And so Ibrahim alayhi salam employed all kinds of methods to try to get them to understand this fact, this truth, this reality. But the people were stubborn, they were reluctant, they didn't want to understand. So Ibrahim alayhi salam took more drastic measures. And what did he do? He smashed and broke all the idols. And when the people returned back, and then he told them that, why don't you ask the idols what happened here? إِلَّا كَبِيرًا لَهُمْ لَعَلَّهُمْ إِلَيْهِ يَرْجِعُونَ. He left a big idol, and he said, why don't you ask him? Ask the idol what ended up happening here and transpiring here. They were so furious that they said, we need to make an example out of him. And we need to defend our idols, our gods, quote unquote. And we need to make an example out of him. And so they built this fire, a huge fire. For days and days, people came from far and wide and threw whatever they had, old clothes, old furniture, anything they could find, they came and they threw it into the fire. To the point where the fire became so huge that they couldn't contain it, they couldn't even go near it. And then they said, now we're going to put Ibrahim inside of the fire and make an example out of him. But they couldn't even get close enough to push him into the fire. So what do we do? So they constructed a catapult-like device that will launch him into the fire. And so they build this device, this contraption, they construct it. And they put Ibrahim alayhi salam in there. And they've tied his hands and his feet so that he can't move. And they place him in there. Now again, anyone looking at this situation would think, look how helpless he is. He's tied up, restrained, he can't move. He's inside of this contraption. They're about to launch him through the air into a fire to die, certain death, doom. But what happens? Ibrahim alayhi salam turns to Allah in that moment. And he says, oh Allah, you are the only one worthy of worship. And oh Allah, I am your slave, I am your servant. I worship you as you deserve to be worshipped. Oh Allah, save me. And then they launch Ibrahim alayhi salam into the air. Sometimes the help doesn't come directly, immediately. There needs to be some patience, some endurance. But the payoff is always worth the wait. The reward is always worth whatever you had to endure. They launch him. He's flying through the air, end over end, just helplessly in the air. But then the narration from Abdullah bin Mas'ud radiyallahu ta'ala anhu tells us, it's as if time freezes. And Jibreel alayhi salam comes to Ibrahim alayhi salam. The Archangel Gabriel comes to him and says that all of creation witnesses in this horror, what is happening to you? Alaka haja. Is there anything that you need? He says, Amma ilayka fala. Wa amma ilallahi fana'am. I don't need anything from you. All I need is Allah. Hasbi Allahu wa ni'mal wakil. And he spoke those words that have been immortalized in the Quran. That Allah is all I need. And Allah is the best caretaker. And then at that time, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exercised His might and His power. So many ways Allah could have saved him. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saved him in the most miraculous way possible, by changing the very nature of the fire. قُلْنَا يَا نَارْ Kuni bardan wa salaman ala Ibrahim. Become cool and peaceful upon Ibrahim. And when Ibrahim alayhi salam landed in that fire, the fire would not burn him, would not affect him. Abdullah bin Masud radiallahu ta'ala anhu says, even the ropes that were tied to his hands and his feet, they're against him, not for him. They're working against him. The ropes burned away from his hands and his feet without harming a single hair on his head, a single spot on his body. And this was the help from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This example is given to us in the Quran to be a symbol of hope in the power of Allah. And as we witness our brothers and sisters all across the world, particularly in Gaza and Palestine, dealing with this onslaught of oppression and violence, let's not lose hope in the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the help of Allah, and keep praying and keep talking about our brothers and sisters, and keep praying and asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to send His help and to send His aid and to send His mercy. Jazakumullahu khairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.